All right, welcome everyone. So happy to see you all here on this nice day. It's not pouring rain, which is very, very nice. We're really happy to have a special guest today. Before I turn it over to Rowan to introduce our speaker, I just want to make a reminder for students to sign in if you're registered and come see me after seminar if you want to get your punch card punched. And I also just want to make a verbal announcement about three things. If you haven't seen them come across your inbox, if you're a student, you're welcome to join Dr. Lee and Will afterward in rate 223 for pizza lunch and a discussion with the speaker. Also, if you are interested in presenting at Lightning Talks, please submit. Today is the last day to submit. So please do that if you're interested. All you have to have is a title and a very short abstract. You don't have to have the poster already made. And then the last thing is, some of you may have heard about the professional development workshop that we're organizing for navigating the job market. That was supposed to be on next Tuesday, the 12th. And I heard there were some conflicts, so we've moved it to Wednesday, the 13th from 10 to 11. That is on the website if you go look it up. But for those of you who maybe wrote it off and thought you had a conflict, maybe you check your schedule now. I think it'll be really good for those of you who are on the job market this year or next year. And without further ado, Ron.
Thank you, Jessica. Yes, hello everyone and welcome to our seminar series. It's my absolute pleasure to present Dr. Hee-Jung Lee. I'll read his bio now for you all. Dr. Lee is an assistant professor in the Department of City Planning in the Graduate School of Environmental Studies at Seoul National University. His research has focused on the impacts of demographic change on housing markets, the consequences of neighborhood change on urban policy, and the jointness of mobility, residential location, and housing tenure choice. Prior to joining the department, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University and assistant professor of housing and property management at Virginia Tech. And he received his PhD in urban planning and development and a master's of planning from the University of Southern California and a BS and an MS in civil and environmental engineering from Seoul National University. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lee.
Thank you, Rawan, for the excellent and long introduction. That is pretty long. So, hello everyone. Thank you for being here today. This is gorgeous day, right? This gives me a very kind of biased and wrong, image of Seattle. When I think of Seattle, I always think of like foggy, rainy days. But it seems like such a beautiful place, right? So my name is Hee-Jung Lee. The most frequent question that I get is, how can I pronounce your name? And like, it's Hee-Jung, and my academic advisor called me like Ho-Jung for 2 years. So I'm totally fine with calling me Ho-Jun, Ho-Jung, whatever it could be, but simpler version would be just Dr. Lee or Mr. Lee, something like that. And before I go, I have to disclose something that, because I used the confidential version of the census data set at the time, so I just need to say that the thing that I'm presenting today is not from the Census Bureau's view, but our own view. So any kind of errors and kind of typos, whatever it could be, would be on ours, not theirs. So today, I'm gonna basically present the stories that we tried to show in 2 different papers. So it is kind of condensed version of our social forces paper, and then the one that we are currently doing on suburban gentrification. So this work was joined by collaboration with Christian Perkins at Georgetown University, who happened to be my postdoc fellow at the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard. And it started in a very small office room that Christian and I were located in. And in there, having lunch together, we talked about gentrification. And the key issue was this: does gentrification cause displacement? Does gentrification, is it really good thing or bad thing? And then sometimes answer was yes, based on rigorous studies by Brown, Salasino, and then Bermet and Reed, saying that gentrification does displace those low income and socially vulnerable populations. But sometimes there are some other papers that basically shows that there's no effect, or there's very modest displacement effect on those low income or vulnerable population. So there's always yes and no kind of answers. Just like coffee is good for your health or bad your health, every time you get different answer. So we wanted to know, okay, there are so many kind of good researchers that we believe says yes, sometimes says no, other times. So what brings this kind of inconsistency in terms of the result of their researches? So one very clear candidate was maybe they use different measures. Believe it or not, I really try to avoid the user term gentrification or study anything related to gentrification during my doctoral years, because I really hated the term itself, because nobody knows what is gentrification at all. Nobody can clearly define gentrification with 100% confidence. So many people define gentrification differently. They obviously uses different measures for gentrification. So that kind of thing may result in different outcomes, so that we may have yes and no kind of answers. But it turned out that this kind of candidate is wrong, because that is rejected, because many papers tested their results based on alternative measures of gentrification, and they got pretty consistent outcomes in terms of yes and no answers. So our next candidate was spatial heterogeneity or meta heterogeneity, which basically make us to do this kind of study, because there are a lot of the articles that suggest that there might be some spatial heterogeneity in terms of the neighborhood processes, including gentrification. So maybe some papers, if you can recognize some of them, because of some paper focused on what's happening in New York, what's happening in Philadelphia, what's happening in San Francisco, they may result in different answers. So in this paper, we examined the relationship between regional mobility and gentrification by comparing regional mobility out of gentrifying neighborhoods with that mobility out of similar gentrifiable but non-gentrifying areas. But our focus is on the second part more. So we wanted to examine difference across different metropolitan areas in general. So it looks like this. There would be a universe of gentrifiable neighborhoods. And on one hand, there are gentrifying neighborhoods. On the other hand, there's gentrifiable but non-gentrifying neighborhoods. And if we somehow get different kind of rate of regional mobility or different kind of quality of regional mobility, then we may indicate that this is supportive evidence of different impact of gentrification. And then if we do see different outcomes across different types of MSAs or MSA clusters, we may argue that, okay, the relationship between gentrification and regional mobility differ across the areas, so local context matters in terms of interpreting the outcome of gentrification. So that was our idea. So in doing so, let me explain how we define gentrifiable and gentrifying and non-gentrifiable neighborhoods. So there are many people define the term gentrification differently, as I mentioned before. But here we adopted a definition of gentrification that refers to an influx of residents with higher socioeconomic status in terms of their educational attainment, their income, their wealth, into originally low income and central urban neighborhood. So there are some elements that we take from this kind of definition. So the first, to be a gentrifiable neighborhood, that neighborhood satisfy two criteria. One is that must be located in central and urban area. We use administrative definition that is primary principal cities. So if a certain place is within MSA's largest principal city, which would be LA, city of Los Angeles in the LA case, or city of New York in the New York case, and up to two additional cities with 100,000 plus population, which would include Long Beach or some other Newark, that kind of cities as well. And another criterion is low income. So a certain neighborhood must be low income to be gentrifiable neighborhoods. There might be many different ways to define them, but here we consider a certain census tract as low income if that neighborhood has median income in the bottom 40% of MSA's income distribution. So in the Washington DC's case, it looks like this. So there are three different primary principal cities are included as central and urban area, constitute central and urban area, Washington, Arlington, and Alexandria. Other than that, it'll be non-central, non-urban area. And then there must be some low-income neighborhoods within the Washington, D.C. MSA, and we selected those central strands in the bottom 40% of their income distribution. So the common ground between the two would be gentrification, which is shown in an orange color in this map. So we defined our universe, gentrifiable neighborhoods, and among them there must be gentrifying neighborhoods or other non-gentrifying neighborhoods. So in here we define gentrification using the DA plus share, which is the share of college graduates in a census tract area. And we ranked each census tract within MSA percentile. It could be bottom 1%, bottom 10%, 50%, top 10%, top 5%, etc., etc. So this map shows their MSA percentile rank of percent in 2010. So you can see in the western side of the DC and Northern Virginia generally have higher percentile rank, meaning that there are lots of BA plus graduates in that neighborhood. In the eastern side of the DC and the Maryland area have relatively fewer number and share of those college graduates. So their rank is pretty low. And then this is their rank in 2019. So you can see a slight changes. So I can show you in this color. So if it is green, that means there's been improvement in their MSA percentile. So they were, say, 60th percentile, now they are 75th percentile. They were 20th percentile, now they are 40th percentile, something like that. So if there are some substantial improvements in its within MSA percentile rank by this BA plus share, then we call that neighborhood as gentrifying neighborhoods. So within gentrifiable neighborhoods, these green color neighborhoods are gentrified neighborhoods in our definition. So let me show you some of the example in DC. In 2000, downtown area and then Chinatown and Navy Yard and Shaw and that kind of area was very substantially gentrified. And then moved to southeastern, northeastern part of the city that Woodridge and then Petworth and then Anacostia, those areas are substantially gentrified in 2010s. And this is a map of Chicago, and this is a map in Seattle. In 2000, I do not know this area very well, so I just Googled a little bit. So the places nearby Seattle University, Chinatown, North Beacon, those areas were substantially gentrified. In 2010s, from 2010 to 2020, Chinatown International District, I do not know the name, Riverview, Hyde Park. If you think they are gentrified, then our definition works pretty well. So then we wanted to not only to know about the association between gentrification and racial mobility, but differences across different metropolitan areas. So for us, it was important to somehow classify those metropolitan areas. And we did so by using PCA and cluster analysis rather than doing that by ourselves. We might have done that by population size, maybe housing price, but we don't want to do that by our own kind of objective kind of method or judgment rather than let computer or machine determines that by themselves. So what we do was we put a bunch of metro level variables into the model. So we included 33 metro level variables of 366 MSAs into the model, which looks like this. So it has some population variables, socioeconomic variables, and housing variables. Mostly you can get from the census data set, and then run the PCA analysis to find out 8 principal components that have an eigenvalue over 1, which basically tells me that principal components explain more than one variable in this kind of variables. So we ultimately reduced the number of variables from 33 to 8 principal components. And using that principal components, we mapped each city in 8 kind of dimensional kind of space. And then let computer group them into 8 clusters based on their characteristics reflected in principal components. So it gave me these 8 types of metropolitan areas. The first type includes Seattle was large coastal area, as you can imagine. It has huge and dense population and have relatively high socioeconomic status. And then second tier, kind of large southern and midwestern metropolitan areas. And third type was Inland Empire and Texan border, which had pretty high poverty rate and then high Hispanic and immigrant population. And fourth was southern metropolitan areas have relatively high share of African Americans and very affordable housing costs and having low population density and others. And fifth was Plain Mountain. Sixth was formerly industrial, kind of small Midwestern, central metropolitan areas. Seventh was retirement destinations, mostly in Florida and then Arizona. And then eighth was college towns. They stand out as very kind of unique metropolitan types. So given that I used the confidential version of American Community Survey to analyze residential mobility patterns. So if you are familiar with ACS public use micro data set, the confidential version is just about the same, except the fact that it provides current residents at census block level. And previous residents, if they moved at census block level, which gave me on power to identify where they live, whether that was gentrified neighborhoods or not, a year ago, and where they live now. So we used 2011 to 2019 ACS 1-year micro data sample, and our sample only includes those people 25 plus with less than PA plus, because we were interested in those socially vulnerable population. But when we did our analysis for the full 25 plus population, the results are pretty consistent. So our regression model examines the relationship between resident mobility and gentrification this way. Resident mobility outcome can be mobility rate. So it could have 1 if they move to a different neighborhood and 0 not. Or we tested another kind of type of resident mobility, which is out of city, out of MSA. And then we wanted to quantify the quality of resident mobility. In terms of whether it was upward or downward mobility. If somebody moved to a better neighborhood or worse neighborhood based on poverty rate or median income. So we had this kind of 5 different dependent variables with the gentrification indicator that, as you saw, there could be intense or substantial gentrification or moderate gentrification or non-gentrification. So, and that is with some typical controls at individual level and neighborhood level. But the key is that, not shown here, but we interacted that gentrification variable with metropolitan type so that we can have different effects of gentrification on regional mobility across different type of the metropolitan area. So briefly explaining the results. I don't want to show this in these numbers, small numbers, so I made it a graph that makes your eye much clearer. You're good. So the first one that I want to show is about the results for those large coastal or large southern and midwestern metropolitan areas. Yeah.
On the data, just maybe what I was curious about is how many moves, and the number of moves in the ACS that we have, how many of those are MSA within MSA, or what extent are we capturing this general residential mobility in this data?
So our outcome is reported 1-0. So this could be interpreted as share of those our denominator universe who move to a different neighborhood. So it is 9.2%. So 9.2% of those people who are 25 plus, who have less than PhD degree, moved within 12 months from 2011 to 2019. And about 2% moved to different MSA, which is pretty small, about a fifth of foreign moved to different areas. And there's a really small portion of people who move to within the same census tract, but between different houses, but that is really small. Yeah, and with that, let me show some difference in terms of relationship between gentrification and racial mobility in terms of moving out of the neighborhood. So here, this graph basically shows that the people who lived in gentrifying neighborhoods, substantially or intensively gentrifying neighborhoods, tend to have about 1 percentage points higher mobility rate compared to those people who are living in non-gentrifiable but non-gentrifying. If he was in large coastal area, which is the first one. And then if somebody is in moderately gentrifying neighborhood, he or she would have 0.4 percentage points greater probability of moving out of that neighborhood compared to somebody who are in non-gentrifying area. So you may think this number is pretty small. So effect of gentrification is pretty small, but when you think about the overall share of people who are moving, it is about 10%. So 1 percentage points difference is huge when you are comparing it to say 11% versus 10% or 10% to 9%. So it is about the same in large coastal and large southern Midwestern areas. So if you are referring to a certain papers based on those large coastal area or large southern Midwestern area, it represents what's happening in the cities pretty well. But what about some smaller metropolitan areas like Inland Empire and Texan border? It turned out that gentrification has nothing to do with regional mobility in terms of the mobility rate. Whereas in retirement destinations and college town, gentrification have very strong and positive relationship with regional mobility. So even when you are in moderately gentrifying neighborhoods in college town or intensely gentrifying neighborhoods in college town, that gives you 2.5 percentage points or 2.1 percentage points greater probability of moving out of your town. So which is pretty substantial. So there are substantial variation across different types of metropolitan area in terms of the relationship between gentrification and regional mobility. But another thing that I want to talk about is the quality of mobility, regional mobility. So here I mentioned that the impact of gentrification on regional mobility rate itself might be smaller than retirement destination and college town in large coastal and the large southern Midwestern cities, but it was much more detrimental in such cities in terms of they are moving to worse neighborhoods. So if you are in gentrifying neighborhoods, you will, and you move, then you will have about 1.8 percentage points greater poverty rate of destination compared to somebody who moved from non-gentrifying but gentrifiable neighborhoods. So they had much worse mobility outcomes compared to non-gentrifying neighborhoods. That was pretty similar in large southern Midwestern cities as well, whereas that kind of impact was greater in small Midwestern, formerly industrial, and then Plain Mountain metropolitan areas more. And then the areas where had relatively greater mobility rate effects actually saw negative, meaning that there were upward mobility amongst those people who lived in gentrifying neighborhoods in college town and retirement destination. And those impact on regional mobility quality was insignificant in Inland Empire, Texas border metropolitan areas, and southern metropolitan areas. So these kind of, and this is based on median income as well. So these kind of variations across metropolitan area was something that we want to show in our social forces paper. So briefly summarize what we did in the paper was that we just examined the association between gentrification and regional mobility in the nation's 366 MSAs in 2010. And we found gentrification is associated with a modest increase in the probability of moving at the national average level, but that national average level masks substantial variation across different areas. That large southern Midwestern area have large positive significant relationship, whereas that in retirement that in Inland Empire and textile border was insignificant, etc., etc. So I read this paper pretty rapidly because that was already published. So it was about a year ago. So I just wanted to cover the second part of the paper more. So which is about suburban gentrification. So which took about maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So I want to talk about suburban gentrification here because it is, as far as I know, this is first paper that talk about what is happening in our suburban neighborhoods. And part of the reason why is that we think suburb is such a boring and homogeneous place. So it deserves not that, it does not deserve such an, maybe study. But actually what I want to argue is that suburban area is pretty important and it is pretty diverse. So in terms of the population, about 60% of US population is living in suburban area. So based on 2010 and 2020 census data set, there are about 200 million population is living in the suburban area, which accounts for about 60% of total population in 2020. And its population growth is much faster than any other places. Compared to urban areas, pocket areas, it is much faster. So that deserves a certain kind of attention. And suburban area is not something areas look like this. There are much more diverse variations in terms of the urban form and their functions and people who are living in such areas. So there are a wide variety of neighborhood status and neighborhood processes as well amongst the suburban neighborhoods. And there are some regional and ethnic enclaves formed in suburban area. And then they are now at risk of gentrification when millennials are moving into suburban areas. And yes, and whereas lots of the studies have just focused on urban neighborhoods. Do you remember the definition of the urban definition of gentrification that I mentioned before? That definition is only focusing on what is happening in urban central area. That was part of the reason why we selected few census tracts in that principal cities. We wanted to expand that kind of studies into suburban areas. So in this work, we wanted to present a typology of suburban and urban neighborhoods, recognizing the diverse types of the neighborhoods across the area. And we want to say how gentrification is associated differently across different neighborhood types. And then neighborhood trajectories may differ across different neighborhoods when they experience gentrification. And then we wanted to examine the process of this kind of neighborhood change, how they are different, focusing on urban and suburban divide. So there are two dimensions. One is our neighborhood characteristics, 8 neighborhood types, and then there might be urban and suburban dimension as well. So here, let me show how we defined suburban gentrification in this paper. So remember that definition that I mentioned, an influx of residents with higher socioeconomic status into originally low-income central urban neighborhoods. So here, I delete central urban part and then say that an influx of residents with higher social SES into originally low-income and suburban neighborhood, that could be a suburban gentrification. But somebody might ask me, what is suburban area? This is another example that nobody knows, clear definition of suburban area. But here, for convenience, given that so many papers have conducted, so many gentrification papers conducted on principal cities, let's say that any other areas than MSA's largest principal city or up to 2 large cities as suburban areas. So here in the DC cases, some part of the Fairfax County and then Montgomery County, Baltimore, Baltimore. So Maryland, that kind of places of the Washington DC MSA. But we will have the consistent definition of low-income neighborhoods as those neighborhoods with a median income at the bottom of 40% of MSA's income distribution. But we realized that in suburban area, neighborhood ascent can be happen without gentrification. Sometimes there might be large development, greenfield development that create newly like master plan communities that may result in substantial increases in, say, college graduate. So we don't want it to consider them as gentrifying neighborhood. So we wanted to exclude a certain area that have a greater population density of at least, we want to have, not exclude. We want to have census area that have a certain level of population density, which is at least 10,000 people per square mile. But we wanted to have some areas with fewer newly built housing units. So have at least 50% of housing units before 2010. So not excluded. So we are including census tracts that are with a population density of at least 1,000 people per square mile, and then with at least 50% of housing units built before 2010, or in the last 10 years. So our gentrifying neighborhoods would be a certain gentrifiable neighborhood that experiences substantial improvement in EA plus rank in 2000 and 2010. So this is consistent with previous definition. So this is how it looks like across different MSA areas. So last time I focused on the central part of the metropolitan area, but now we are zoomed out from the area. So in the blue, you can see where urban gentrification is happening. What happened in 2000 in New York area, including like Harlem, and then some Brooklyn and Bronx area, like Long Island City is in there. But also you can see darker red colors, which is gentrified suburban area, which is outside of those two cities, that include lots of the New Jersey area. Here, gentrified area in 2010s in New York, again, lots of those suburban gentrified neighborhoods showed up. This is Washington, D.C. Along with the red line, you can see Rockville and Middle Street Park that is gentrified in the northwestern part of the DC area in 2000s and 2010s again, we see some suburban gentrification in DC area. And this is Atlanta, and this is Seattle. I do not know the area very well, but it seems like there are some neighborhoods at the southern part of Seattle and the northern part of Seattle that is gentrified, but they are technically in suburban area. And this is 2010 and 2020. I Googled it and found some names like Lake Mountain. What's that name? I don't know. Mount Lake. Yeah. There is Mount Lake. And another place I forgot the name. But there are some kind of suburban gentrified neighborhoods. And we recognize that as gentrifying neighborhood, then our methods works pretty well. So we wanted to focus on what happened to that kind of neighborhood in here. And then previously, we somehow classify our MSAs based on their characteristics. Quite similarly, this time, we want to classify our neighborhood or census tract based on their characteristics. So instead of 33 neighborhood variables, now we include 32 neighborhood level variables in 2010. And compared to previous case, we included some more variables, given that the comments that we got from our reviewers, like their industrial mix as well, like percent of people who are working in agriculture or manufacturing industry, or income inequality within the census tract, or distance from CBD. What about housing price? Actually, Census Bureau have the variables like housing value and gross median rent, but there might be some areas in New York that have no owner-occupied units, or some suburban areas have no renter-occupied units that have missing value for that kind of variable. So we merge them into one housing price percentile based on their relative position in the price distribution within NSA or gross rent distribution within NSA. And then we also included change variables as well. Change in population, change in income, BA plus share, and housing price percentile in the last 10 years. So if I observe a certain area in 2010, I observe their status in 2010 and change from 2000 to 2010. If I observe a certain area in 2000, 2020, and then I observe their status in 2020 and what has happened from 2010 to 2020. So with that, we also run the cluster analysis and somehow got 8 different types of the neighborhoods, which is shown in here. So the first type was dense urban neighborhoods, which is pretty closely located from CBD and has high population density and greater population share of immigrants and high income inequality, and there are lots of multi-family homes. And the second type was high status, high turnover kind of type, which attracts lots of the singles or those married couple without children who are living in multi-family rental units, and they move around the area pretty frequently, so they have pretty high turnover rates. But they do have high SES in terms of the BA plus share and their income, not income, but their occupation. But since they just form their household, they live there for maybe a year or two and then move to another area. That is the area that attracts such population. And third was distressed, that reports pretty high share of children and African American population and single mom households and high poverty rate, unemployment. So they generally have low social SES, and then they experience population decline in the last 10 years. In New York's case, it'll be somewhere around Newark area. And then there were Hispanic enclaves as well, that has characterized by their high share of kids and Hispanic population, immigrants, and those people working in the manufacturing industry. And fifth was what we call melting pot suburbs that have pretty diverse population, that have pretty even distribution across racial and ethnic groups, across white, African American, Asian, and Hispanic, and have fairly high socioeconomic status in terms of their income, BA plus share, housing prices, but largely they are located in somewhat suburban areas, so we call them like melting pot suburbs. And then sixth type is the most kind of common kind of view on suburban area, which is affluent, have very high SES, very low turnover rate, and very high share of white and homeowners in general. And seventh and eighth are pretty relatively rare in urban, relatively closer to metropolitan area, are new towns and rural areas. So new towns are generally far from CBD and high share of newly built homes and high share of kids. It is kind of kids-friendly, family-friendly area. And the rural area is also far from CBD, but having lots of the senior population and white population, having lots of the homeowners, etc., etc. So we had 8 kind of different clusters, and how it looked like in New York. So there are some dense urban area and high status, high turnover area in urban part or closer to CBD. And then suburban area, mostly affluent, because you can see some ethnic enclaves over there. And this is 2020. So definitely there's been some neighborhood changes over time. Their status has changed. So we will examine these kind of neighborhood trajectories as well a little bit later. And this is what it looked like in Chicago, highly segregated city. So you can see downtown area are kind of filled with lots of high status, high turnover type of neighborhoods. But also you will have Black communities and Hispanic communities in relatively kind of inner ring area and affluent neighborhoods in outer ring area. And that is changed over time a little bit as well. And this is Washington, DC, also highly segregated area. And it's how changed. And this is a map of Seattle. So in the downtown Seattle, there are lots of high status, high turnover area with lots of the rental apartments that holds lots of the married couple without children or singles And then affluent people living in suburban part of the city. And there are some Hispanic enclaves. There are no distressed enclaves over there, but there are some Hispanic enclaves there. And that is converted to melting pot suburbs sometimes, or to new townish area. So this is our preliminary result, how gentrification look like across different kind of area in terms of the urban and suburban and different types of neighborhoods. So first, what we want to say is we have to acknowledge this fact. So generally, a greater number and share of urban area than suburban tract or neighborhoods are eligible for gentrification, meaning that they are low-income areas. And the rate of gentrification, the share of those gentrifiable neighborhoods that actually gentrified over time are higher in urban area, which is about 41%, compared to suburban area, which is about 31%. So it is true that still urban area has greater number and share of gentrifying neighborhoods, but still you can see there are pretty substantial number and share of suburban neighborhoods that experience neighborhood ascent in 2010s. So suburban gentrifying neighborhoods accounts for about 40% of gentrification that took place in the top 50 metropolitan area that is included in our analysis. And in 2010, there are about 7.6 million people who lived in those gentrifying suburban neighborhoods. So it is pretty substantial. So studying in this area is kind of deserves a certain attention that we believe. So when we measure prevalence of gentrification across different neighborhood types that introduces 8 different types, that showed quite different patterns across urban and suburban areas. So we analyzed how gentrification took place in urban, say, distressed area versus suburban distressed area, or urban suburban Hispanic enclaves versus suburban Hispanic enclaves. This title was not updated, so we quoted one suburban enclaves, but later we changed melting pot suburbs. But in general, what we can see is there's no variation across different types of neighborhoods in urban area in terms of its prevalence of gentrification. Almost 40%. Almost 40% of all neighborhood types were gentrified in 2010. But it turned out that in suburban area, that rate varies pretty substantially across different neighborhood types, from 24% in melting pot suburbs to 39% in dense urban suburban neighborhoods. So there's some difference between urban and suburban. And this is the difficult part that analyzes neighborhood trajectories over time. So here, what I show is their neighborhood status in 2010 and how they changed over time in 2020. So their status in 2010, snapshot, their status in 2020, snapshot. So it shows that about 86% of once dense urban neighborhood in 2010 stayed in the same neighborhood type in 2020. About 8.8% of dense urban neighborhood in 2010 become high status, high turnover type in 2020. You can see that kind of trend. And you can see green colors in diagonal, basically meaning that lots of the neighborhoods stayed in the same neighborhood type over time, but some are moved around different types. So the upper panel shows a trend in gentrifying urban neighborhood. If some neighborhood experience gentrification, once dense urban neighborhood sometimes stayed in the same status, but they move to another status, which is high status turnover. And the bottom one is gentrifiable, but not gentrifying. So they are about the same, but the fact that they didn't experience gentrification. So if I deduct each number from top, then I will get this number. The difference between urban gentrifying and urban non-gentrifying. That basically shows that when you are experiencing gentrification, you will have much greater probability of moving into a certain group, which is high status, high turnover type over time, if you are in urban area. There are some different kind of trajectories shown as well, from say Hispanic enclaves to melting pot suburbs, or melting pot suburbs to affluent neighborhoods. But in general, these trends transition into high status, high turnover neighborhood type kind of dominates all the different kind of neighborhood trajectories. That was found in urban area. This is for suburban area. So as before, top panel shows what happened to gentrify suburban neighborhood, their status in 2010, the experience of gentrification, and what is their status in 2020. And the bottom shows what happened to those gentrifiable but non-gentrifying suburban neighborhoods. Again, I will deduct the two numbers and got this result. And if you compare those two, the difference amongst urban neighborhoods and difference amongst suburban neighborhoods. This is difference in suburban neighborhoods. There are some difference in that. When suburban neighborhoods gentrify, they do not necessarily move to make transition into high status, high turnover type. Sometimes they have much greater tendency for those Hispanic enclaves moving to melting pot suburb type. And for melting pot suburbs, you will have greater tendency to move to new town-ish neighborhood. If you're rural area, you will have much greater, much smaller tendency to move to high turnover, high status neighborhood type. So we found some differences between the two. So we think somehow neighborhood processes in terms of gentrification is differ across urban area versus suburban area. So we may need another kind of set of studies focusing on these kind of neighborhoods. So with that, I will quickly summarize what I've done so far. So we examined prevalence of gentrification in 2010 from 2010 to 2020 across 8 different neighborhood types, focusing on urban and suburban divide. And what we found was location matters, local context matters. Where urban gentrification is more prevalent in absolute and relative terms, especially in suburban areas, that varies a lot. And suburban gentrification differs from urban gentrification in 2 respects. First one was prevalence of gentrification, significantly varies across neighborhood types that I mentioned. Second is about gentrification, neighborhood trajectories among gentrifying neighborhoods compared to non-gentrifying neighborhoods are much more diverse in suburban area compared to urban area. So as I mentioned, this is largely kind of preliminary. So we will do additional analysis in the coming next weeks, if not months. We will check some different gentrification outcomes, such as we are interested in the topics of displacement. We are measuring kind of mobility outcomes in terms of both quantity as mobility rate and quality as their destination neighborhood characteristics across different neighborhood types. And then we may want to run, I don't want to do this, but run the regression models to examine the association. I don't want to do this. I just want to keep this paper as descriptive. But also, I know that our study is inherently vulnerable to those comments about why do you think gentrification is such a thing? Why do you think suburban is such a thing? Et cetera, et cetera. So the best thing to address, what I learned from last time was that the best way to address that is showing some consistency across different definitions. So last time I had a crazy matrix using 8 different definitions of gentrification with 4 different definitions of low-income neighborhoods and show consistency across different definitions. And reviewer said, so we're gonna do that again. And then maybe using different kind of set of MSAs from top 50 to 100 and all MSAs. So with that, I'm concluding my presentation. If you have any questions and comments, they'll be very, very welcome. Thank you.
hadn't considered that.
for the online. Yep.
Yeah, I think this is super interesting, the technology especially. I have a question for paper, but I'll limit myself to that. So for the first paper you presented, it was notable to me that the college towns seem to experience a relatively higher effect in the other meetings presented. I'm wondering if you believe that is sort of a reflection of the definition being tied to education, so this could be picking up on employment or enrollment changes, or if you think this is fundamentally showing the role of higher education in the.
Definitely. Thank you for your question. So the question that I got was, why do I have this kind of high level of impact of gentrification in college town, sometimes retirement destination, whether that is kind of mechanical kind of issue in terms of how I define gentrifying neighborhoods as substantial improves in P plus share. And we also had same kind of question and same thoughts. But here, the goal of this paper was to show some variation across different metropolitan areas by using the same single kind of measure to say that, hey, if you apply the same methodology or same idea to another area, you will get this kind of results. So I'm 100% agree with you that we may need another kind of measure of gentrification if we want to measure kind of true kind of gentrification in such areas. And I believe that that is pretty possible that movements of those maybe undergrads or employees or faculty members in college town may result in this kind of outcomes. But basically, it is what it is based on our measures and data set. Yeah. Jacob.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your paper. But one thing that I'm wondering about is the dichotomy between urban and suburban.
Yep.
Strikes me as at some extreme arbitrary.
Yep.
So let's consider Hoboken, New Jersey.
Yep.
Hoboken, by your definition, is a suburb.
Yep.
But if you walk around Hoboken, which I had the opportunity to do earlier this year, it looks just like New York City.
Yep.
Like it's indistinct. I mean, it's not Midtown Manhattan, but it could be part of Manhattan. It could certainly be part of Brooklyn. It could certainly be part of Queens. Then consider Seattle. If we were to walk around Seattle, there would be many neighborhoods. So Seattle, because of its own laws, the city is overwhelmingly single-family zoning up until very recently. And so I'm just wondering, why do you think it is important to maintain this distinction when in reality the definition of it's not as though you cross a city limit and the housing stock or the nature of the neighborhood just magically changes wherever you are in the city?
That is very good question. Also, the question that Jacob had was, there might be some suburbanish urban area and urbanish suburban area in terms of the functionality and urban form and other things. Why do I have to maintain the administrative definition of gentrification, urban area or suburban area based on this somewhat arbitrary boundaries? So part of the reason, the motivation for our studies was to break the kind of stereotype idea of doing kind of gentrification study in big cities or doing gentrification studies in urban area. Why not doing that for smaller metropolitan area or different type of the metropolitan area or some other type of the neighborhood? So the reason why we wanted to maintain our definition of urban area like this was that because lots of the previous papers define urban areas based on administrative boundaries, not like functional forms or urban functions or urban forms. So there are some other group of researchers using home ownership or car driving and home ownership as an element of suburban life. So define a certain area as suburban and urban based on that kind of variables. Or there are some group of researchers who's using urban perceptions. I mentioned it here, somewhere here, I guess. That American Housing Survey actually asked those people do you think you are living in an urban area, or do you think you are living in a suburban area or rural area? And they answered their questions and helped people run those sexy kind of machine learning thing using that kind of variable, and then spread that kind of results across the nation, defining, okay, this is urbanish area or suburbanish area, rural area, based on that urban perception definition. So there are multiple different definitions based on different approaches. So later I'm gonna do that, but for this for the purpose of showing some difference between urban and suburban, which is basically means that what we've learned from previous studies versus what we don't know, we just wanted to maintain the definition that is used in previous studies, which is this based on administrative boundaries of city boundaries.
This is just a clarifying question, but how are out of metro states, out of metro slash out of state moves accounted for in the analysis?
Yeah, so we also thought, long distance move is different from short. Yeah, so the question that I had was about how do I incorporate the idea of out of MSA or out of state migration into the model. Indeed, long distance moves is much more disruptive, especially amongst us low SES people. So we thought it may have different meaning when we have like lower mobility impacts for out of neighborhood mobility, and then greater impacts on out of MSA in a certain metropolitan types. But it turned out that they're pretty consistent. If a certain neighborhood have higher impact in out of neighborhood mobility, then they generally have higher out of MSA mobility outcome, et cetera, et cetera. So we tested with the different dependent variable that measures out of neighborhood, out of city, out of metro area, and see the different impact of gentrification on that, but largely they are consistent.
About 2 minutes left. So maybe one more.
Yeah.
So I'm new to this type of research, but one question that I have is that when you were doing the universe of gentrifiable places, one thing that I keep on thinking of, because I think it started, the time horizon was starting with like already for in the 2000s, right? I guess I just keep on thinking of a longer historical horizon and just what I see as gentrification, where I'm more likely to move to, if I'm gentrifying to a place with like with good growth place. I guess I'm wondering if some of those spaces historically were not always poor. May have been nice, like 50 years ago, nice brownstone, then there was fight, people had degentrified, moved. So I think those, like how to distinguish places that like historically had been actually nice, that are just, have a full circle coming back, versus places that were never nice.
Which is excellent question, and then the answer is we couldn't include all the kind of previous neighbor status variables in our model due to lack of the limitations, but we wanted to check whether previous experience in gentrification impacted or just controlled for historical neighbor changes, including gentrification in 1990s and gentrification in 2000 variables in our model, saying that controlling for these previous experiences, here our results are good. Actually, we compared our coefficients with and without those variables. That does not change that much, meaning that, it means a lot, but at least based on our model, it does not impact on our findings. So our conclusion that the relationship between the two are this amount is not influenced by having or having not this kind of.
Thank you so much for your.
Thank you. Thank you.
Don't forget to have events, we'll follow Will.
Thank you. Yeah, I did. Should I go?